The box you're placed in sometimes turns into a prison with no visible walls. Let me ask you something. Do you remember a moment when you truly felt free? Or is freedom simply an idea you carry in your mind? An unreachable utopia? Something you can imagine but never quite touch or hold on to? Perhaps it's a feeling you believe in, yet have never fully possessed. This question will follow you throughout this story. Like a quiet shadow, it will stay close, making itself known even while you search for an answer. When we talk about the rules of society, we usually look at them from the outside. We talk about laws, norms, and morality. These things are visible. They can be measured, debated, and analyzed. Yet the feeling of suffocation rarely begins there. It usually starts within invisible threads, unspoken expectations, subtle sparks of shame, sometimes even a single glance. It is here that the voice of Dostoyevsky's underground man begins to echo. His inner voice reminds us of something deeply unsettling. A person can feel both guilty and innocent at the same time. And this contradiction becomes one of the darkest mirrors we carry within ourselves. Society's rules do not only restrict us from the outside. Over time, they quietly ask us to silence our own words, desires, and impulses. Silence settles into the lungs like an invisible tube, tightening our breath without us even realizing how deeply it has entered us. At first, accepting the rules feels easy. When we follow them, life seems more orderly and predictable. Uncertainty fades and a sense of safety grows. But order often demands a price, a fragmented self. The small rebellions within us are gradually pushed down and forgotten. This suppression begins to shape not only our behavior but also our thoughts. Because society's rules rarely function as a mirror. More often they act as a template. And the stricter the template becomes, the less room remains inside it. But human beings are creatures who need space. We need space to dream, to regret, to remember. Space to feel shame, to love, and to lose. Every one of these emotions occupies a place within us. Yet templates are too narrow to contain the full range of human feeling. One of the most unsettling traits of Dostoyevsky's narrator is his ability to belittle himself. This habit grows stronger in the mirror of society. Because society constantly whispers the same quiet message to the individual: you are not the person you are supposed to be. Over time, this message begins to sink in. Once it becomes internalized, it stops sounding like an outside voice and slowly transforms into your own. When a person begins arguing with their own voice, the pressure from the outside does not disappear. In fact, it becomes even stronger. Because now you are not only trying to satisfy society, you are also trying to satisfy the observer that lives inside you. And that inner observer is often far more ruthless than society itself. After all, it lives with you 24 hours a day. Society's rules can sometimes function like a persuasive poison. They appear reasonable. Through them, guilt, shame, and deviance become visible and identifiable. But this visibility also begins another process, the slow fragmentation of the self. Gradually, a person begins to play a role. They breathe within the limits of that role, speak within its boundaries, and remain silent within it as well. This role is usually performed to satisfy the expectations of others. And the approval of others offers a brief sense of relief. But relief is not the same as truth. It only covers the truth for a while. And everything we hide eventually becomes an invisible weight we carry in our hearts. As people internalize society's rules, they usually arrive at one of two paths. They either accept the rules without questioning them, or they live in constant conflict with them. The first path appears harmonious and calm. The second path is far more exhausting, more bitter, but also in many ways more honest. Dostoyevsky's underground man often represents the tragic face of this second path. He lives in a constant state of conflict, both with himself and with the world around him. At times he blames himself, at other times he blames the world. Yet this conflict is not simply a fracture. Sometimes it becomes a form of resistance, because freedom rarely exists in perfect harmony with rules. Freedom almost always carries the risk of losing something. Sometimes freedom begins with a simple realization. The self that society defines is not the same as the self you feel inside. At this point, it becomes impossible not to hear the voice of the underground man more clearly. His words are not just observations about society, they are confessions about the strange contradictions of being human. In Notes from Underground, he makes a deeply uncomfortable declaration. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. At first the sentence almost sounds absurd, but beneath its strange tone lies a disturbing truth about self-awareness. The underground man does not simply suffer under society's expectations. He dissects himself under their light. He examines his own weaknesses with brutal clarity, yet refuses to escape them. At another moment he writes, I swear to you, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness. And this idea sits at the center of his struggle. Awareness, instead of liberating him, becomes another kind of prison. The more he understands himself, the less capable he becomes of acting freely. Society celebrates reason, structure, and predictability. It imagines that human beings can be arranged like mathematical equations, that if the correct rules are followed, the outcome will always be rational. But the underground man rejects this illusion with bitter irony. He argues that people will sometimes act against their own interests simply to prove that they are free. As he puts it, what man wants is simply independent choice, whatever that independence may cost and wherever it may lead. It is a frightening thought, because it suggests that freedom is not always logical, not always productive, and certainly not always comfortable. Sometimes freedom appears in the form of rebellion, self-sabotage, or irrational defiance. Society, however, has little patience for that kind of freedom. It prefers predictable individuals, people who behave according to familiar patterns and move along the tracks already laid out before them. The underground man recognizes this pressure and despises it. Yet he cannot fully escape it either. His rebellion turns inward. He isolates himself, not because solitude is pleasant, but because it allows him to preserve the fragile illusion that his thoughts still belong to him. At one point he writes something that feels like a quiet scream hidden beneath the surface of the text. Man sometimes prefers suffering to prosperity. This line forces us to confront a difficult possibility. Perhaps suffering is sometimes chosen because it feels more authentic than a life lived entirely according to someone else's expectations. Happiness that is prescribed can begin to feel artificial, like a role written by another person. The underground man senses this artificiality everywhere. Even kindness from others feels suspicious to him, because he cannot tell whether it is genuine or simply another social script being performed. His bitterness grows out of this endless uncertainty. Yet beneath that bitterness lies something fragile and painfully human, the desperate desire to remain an individual, not a function, not a number, not a predictable component in society's machinery. When he mocks the idea of a perfectly rational society, a world where every desire can be calculated and every action predicted, he does so because he senses that such a world would erase something essential within the human soul. If every decision were rational, if every action were efficient, then freedom itself might quietly disappear. And so he insists almost stubbornly that human beings will always protect the right to choose badly, irrationally, even destructively. Because the moment that right disappears, something deeper disappears with it. This is the paradox at the center of the underground man's voice. He is trapped by his own awareness, suffocated by society, yet unwilling to surrender the chaotic and unpredictable freedom that makes him human. And when we listen to him long enough, we begin to notice something unsettling. His contradictions are not entirely foreign to us. They reflect something we quietly recognize within ourselves. The feeling of suffocation rarely arrives during dramatic moments. Instead, it grows in small, almost invisible experiences. When you hide a truth, when you tell a lie, when you suppress a desire because of shame. Each moment seems insignificant on its own, but over time they accumulate. A person who lives in harmony with society learns to ignore these small contradictions. Yet every act of ignoring becomes a kind of internal debt, and sooner or later that debt must be repaid. Sometimes it returns as anxiety, sometimes as sleepless nights, and sometimes as something quieter, the feeling of watching life from a distance instead of truly living it. Watching yourself live is a strange experience. The more a person observes themselves, the more distant they become from their own life. It is like watching the same scene again and again. Eventually, the scene continues to play, but the life within it fades away. Society's rules can trap life inside this endless repetition. The same reactions, the same expectations, the same patterns of behavior. And one day you realize something unsettling. The color has slowly drained from your life. You are no longer fully living, you are simply representing life. Fear appears in many forms. We fear rejection. We fear failure. We fear loneliness. Society strengthens these fears because breaking the rules usually leads to punishment. But punishment is not always obvious. Sometimes it is a glance, sometimes gossip, sometimes silent exclusion. These subtle punishments create a powerful defense mechanism in the individual, the hiding of desire. Yet suppressed desires never truly disappear. They simply change direction. At some point, repressed anger begins to break its own rules. And when that moment arrives, the consequences can become destructive for both the individual and society. This is why Dostoyevsky's exploration of the human soul feels so unsettling. He shows us that human beings are both fragile and explosive at the same time. Why are society's rules so powerful? Because they do more than maintain order. They also create a system of meaning. This system tells us how life should be lived. It defines what is valuable and what is worthless. At first, it feels like a guide. But over time, the line between guide and chain begins to blur. Eventually, the individual begins carrying that guide on their own shoulders. And as the weight grows heavier, their steps grow smaller. The courage to search for new paths slowly begins to fade. Yet within the quiet interior of a person's life, a small flame continues to exist. A question, a desire, perhaps even a hidden sense of guilt. The winds of society constantly try to extinguish this flame, but when the flame finally goes out, it leaves behind not only darkness, but also an emptiness. It is precisely at this moment that a person faces a difficult question. Are you truly living your own life? Or are you simply repeating a life designed by others? Anyone who desires freedom must also confront the cost of freedom. Because freedom often means losing approval. It means questioning the existing order. Sometimes it even means standing alone. And a person who refuses to see this price often takes refuge in the rules instead. the refuge feels safe. But if you stay there too long, you begin to suffocate. This is the tragedy of Dostoyevsky's underground man. He thinks about freedom. He longs for it. Yet at the same time he fears it. And the traps a person sets for themselves often become the strongest chains of all. Now let us return to the question from the beginning of this story. If this thought feels familiar to you, don't rush to answer it. Let the unease remain for a moment. Because sometimes the restlessness inside a person is not a problem, but a sign of a hidden truth. And perhaps the real question is this. If one day all of society's rules were to fall silent, for just a moment no one judged you, which part of yourself would you rescue and dare to truly live for the very first time?